situations where there's no other better alternative, and in situations where we need a method that guarantees long-term stability and long-term development in a country, we think that the best method should be in place in such countries, right? We think that given the rise of the Islamic State, this House would support military intervention in Syria as well as Iraq. But let's go to a few definitions. And what do we mean by the rise of the Islamic State? Or what do we mean by the Islamic State? And here we're talking about a jihadist as well as terrorist group that aims to actually take over both Syria and Iraq. But what more specifically they do is that they want to enforce Islam principles that focus basically on Sharia law, which firstly actually prevents Western involvement in Islamic states, but over and above that has other principles that do things like demoralize women and actually prevents the education of women in such countries. We think that's the first moral imperative as to why we should actually make efforts to prevent them from taking over these countries. But what do we mean by this house? And by this house, we tell you that we mean the United Nations Security Council, as well as all diplomatic allies of Syria, as well as Iraq. And this is firstly because those very diplomatic allies have interests in Syria, as well as Iraq, and therefore have the mandate to do what's best for them, as well as those countries. And this is secondly because the United Nations is a peacekeeping authority that aims to ensure long-term sustainability, as well as development in the world, right? And here, what do we mean by support? And we mean to give reinforcements in terms of military advice and soldiers in order to fight against the jihadists, in order to fight against the Islamic State. And by military intervention, we mean by actively sending troops, as well as military advice, as well as other military technologies that may help in terms of fighting the Islamic State, right? So let's go on to what we're going to prove. And we're going to prove two things as site-opening government. The first is that a military intervention is the most effective way of resolving the conflict between Syria, Iraq, as well as the Islamic State. And the second thing we're going to prove to you is that a military intervention brings about long-term benefits to Iraq as well as the Islam State's future claims, which are countries such as Palestine. Right? But where does this debate lies? And here we're not going to debate whether or not there's human casualties. We think in such countries where there's already attacks and bombings, there's already human casualties. This debate lies on whether or not a military intervention guarantees long-term development as well as stability in Iraq as well as Syria. So whether or not there are harms, it depends on whether or not there's actually long-term benefits within these countries. Right? So let's go on to what our model actually states, right? The first level to this is that we allow allies of Syria as well as the United Nations peacekeeping missions to send in military intervention. That's in the light of soldiers, in the light of weaponry and other technology that may help, like I've said. But secondly, we'd also urge the future claims of the Islamic State themselves to helping with this intervention and to actually send in their own troops to ensure that this is actually more successful, right? And as your first speaker, I'll show you two things. The first is why there's a moral as well as practical imperative to send military intervention to Syria and Iraq. The second is why foreign states will buy into this policy in the first place. And my second speaker will deal with why this has a positive ripple effect on the future claims of the Islamic State, right? So let's go on to the first issue of contention here. And my thesis is that the nature of the Islamic State doesn't allow for the use of other methods to neutralize the threat present in these countries, right? And what do we mean? And here I've already told you what the Islamic State does and the principles on which they function, which are jihadist principles. But what do we specifically mean by these? And these are principles that actually support things like Sharia law. But what does Sharia law actually do, right? It's laws that firstly govern and give power to men in these very countries. And what they do is that in most cases, one, they do not allow for education to women and children, and girl children. And what that means is that in the long run, the stability as well as education in that country is actually deteriorating. But secondly, it's laws that give power to men in most instances. But before I continue, yes, sir.
Is ISIS the only sole group in the planet that attempts to impose Sharia law? And should we
No,
invade all those countries as well?
it's not the only group, and assuming that they were to base their question on the strategic question that, well, if we can invade or prevent the Islamic State, then we can prevent other groups, would say no. We'd say there's a more immediate threat in Syria and Iraq, and people there are more urged to actually intervene, and there's more reason and there's more necessity for military intervention in Syria as well as Iraq, right? But let's look more into the very goals of these Islamist organizations, of the Islamic State in the long run. And their main aim, basically, is to prevent Western intervention. Why? This is because they believe that they can develop more without Western intervention, and they have more chance of sustaining themselves. But why isn't this true? And this isn't true for two reasons. The first is that the majority of the countries in which the Islamic states function are countries that depend heavily on the Western nations. We see countries like Iraq, where they depend on America mostly to buy their oil, and we see countries like Syria, where they actually depend on a country like Russia for economic aid and economic development. So they wouldn't function and they wouldn't develop effectively without that Western aid. And that is the first reason on which we have to prevent the Islamic State. But secondly, we'd say that in countries that want to develop individually, it's countries that largely isolate their people, and countries where there's mass violations of human rights. We see this in Zimbabwe, firstly. We see this in countries like Egypt, where Mohamed Morsi has engaged in genocides and was involved in mass human rights violations. But we see this also in countries like Libya, right? And we think that this is more reason to actually ensure that there isn't any ripple effect, because if such countries, or if Syria and Iraq are actually taken over, then there's more reason for those very countries, or for that very Islamic State, to go over to their future claims. That's talking about Palestine, and that's talking about Jordan, right? But my second speaker will show you more about how we actually prevent that from happening. Ladies and gentlemen, we stand by long-term development, and we stand by the minimization of harms and threats that are posed to to Iraq as well as Syria. And that is why we'd like to propose this motion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that excellent speech. And now we give the floor to
Madam Speaker, thank you very much for the floor. The motion before the House today is that given the rise of the Islamic State, this House would support military intervention in Syria and Iraq. Now, why we are proud today to oppose this motion on the side of the opposition is because we find such a policy to be ineffective, and this is something that's going to be touched upon by my second speaker, and it's going to actually lead into worse consequences for the people of Iraq and Syria in the first place, right? So such a policy will not only fail to solve the problem of the Islamic State as we currently perceive it, but it's actually going to exacerbate the existing problem and bring it to a whole new level. Now, before I go into my two arguments, which are going to be analysis of the stakeholders, and specifically the stake that Bashar al-Assad has here, so the leader of Syria, and secondly, how we're going to actually lose the PR war here against ISIS, which kind of drives the whole jihadi kind of movement in that region. Let me go into a couple of points of rebuttal. Now, what we were promised today by the side of the government is that we're going to be shown how specifically there is no other or better alternative, and secondly, how this is going to lead to a long-term stability and long-term development. Now, I think it's fair to say that given the history of the region, given the history of Western intervention in Iraq, in Afghanistan, so on and so forth, where we have used the same arguments as the government is using today to try this exercise in nation building, these experiences show that through military intervention, and it doesn't matter how forceful or how powerful the force, in these cases the United States, behind these interventions are, it has never, ever empirically led to more stability, to more development, and to better prosperity for the people.
Sir.
No, thank you. Now, secondly, they've stated that it's the very nature of the Islamic State as a jihadist movement that requires us to take upon this drastic action of the military intervention. But then, responding to my POI, he failed to give us any substantial evidence as to why the Islamic State is so different from other regimes throughout the world. For instance, Sharia law and the brutal treatment of women, denying their political adversaries basic human rights, so on and so forth. This is something that's extremely, unfortunately, common in the entire Middle Eastern region. Let's just take Saudi Arabia for an example. An ally of the West, so we think. But then, again, human rights of political opponents, of dissidents are being violated there. Women are not being allowed to drive cars there. But we don't see the government jumping up and trying to protect these people specifically. I'll take it back.
You say that there are such other government organizations. Then are there any others that are massively killing people and hanging people on the streets?
I think we can find at least 20 or 30 other examples that are functioning right now in Syria, for example, in Iraq, other groups than ISIS, for instance. Now, ISIS came to the forefront a couple of weeks ago because they are the biggest, it's true, but they're not the only one. And this region is not the only one that struggles with security. We have Africa that struggles with security and has struggled for decades. So we see nothing up to this point why intervention in this specific region is necessary and why military intervention in this specific region is going to specifically solve for what we're looking for. Now, let's move on to the opposition's case. Now, there are two very important actors in this case that need to agree with military intervention if we hope to be successful in any sort of way, right? Okay, so we have the Iraq state, whose prime minister did actually call for intervention. So they are covered there. But on the other hand, we have Bashar al-Assad, who might not be seeing how he is a friend of Russia and not really a friend of the West as much, given his human rights trespasses, shall we say. So we don't really see him being very enthusiastic as to welcoming a United Nations force into his country, into his territory. Now, even if we imagine, yes, sir.
Do you think you would be happy to accept ISIS into his territory, or do you think you would prefer that they will stop before they eat?
Sir, what we're saying today and what we're seeing actually is that ISIS is being quite actively and successfully tackled by Bashar al-Assad's forces in Syria. So the main problem that we have in terms of security right now is in north and west of Iraq. So I think that Bashar al-Assad would agree here, is that he's quite capable of handling the situation in Syria himself, as he has done previously. And we have indications that he is quite successful there. Now, but if in the more likely scenario that he does not really agree with the intervention here, what we're doing is creating a war on two fronts. What we're saying is that if we don't have his support, Iran is going to be actively engaged in the conflict as well, since Iran is one of the biggest state sponsors of the Assad regime in this situation, which is going to make the entire thing so much worse. Now, moving on, losing the PR war. Now, why is ISIS as effective as it is? Because it is winning the PR war against the West, ladies and gentlemen, on the ground. They're using Twitter to great effect. They're using this sort of message of heroic nihilism to great effect to really speak to the people there on the ground, to speak to the youth, who are then moving over to the ISIS side to try and tackle and fight the great Western devils, the United States, and so on and so forth. Now, what we're seeing is that with another intervention, just finishing the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, we don't have the public opinion of the people on the ground on our side. So it's going to be extremely difficult for us to be, in any sort of way, effective here. And not only with the people on the ground over there, but also back in our countries, right? We do not see the European forces, the people of the United States, the people that they're trying to envision as the coalition, being very pro another military intervention. They have just finished years of conflicts people are voting to keep the people, militaries out of such interventions, such non-violent wars. And we feel, again, that it's going to be extremely difficult to win such a conflict without the necessary support in the home countries, as well as the people on the ground. And for these reasons, because we're going to lose the PR war, because we do not have the stakeholders on our side, and because ultimately this venture is going to be ineffective, we beg you and we're proud to oppose this motion.
And now we welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to the floor.
So my first speaker came and proved two things today in today's debate. How military intervention is the best solution in this case, and secondly, how military intervention is the best way to ensure long-term benefits. And I'll further extend on that later, just mentioned. But before that, let's get on a bit of my rebuttal. Now under this, I'll be analyzing opposition's case with one simple question: which side best caters to progress within these countries themselves? Now this is where we look at the first level of how we exacerbate the problem, which is what they said we do. Now they looked at ISIS and at the example of ISIS and how it works, and they said no, how it doesn't work, and they said no, the ISIS hasn't actually worked and hasn't actually had long-term benefits. Now what we said in our first speech was that firstly, by supporting, we also mean reinforcing and reinforcing, and secondly, bettering our military legitimacy and actually going to these countries and invading. But other than that, ladies and gentlemen, they haven't shown us how we exactly directly exacerbate this problem. But even if we did, ladies and gentlemen, I'll show you in my positive matter how we don't actually do that. Now they said another thing they told us was how people are voting for in these countries for not having military intervention within their own borders. We understand these people have their own sovereignty within their country, but to what extent do we value sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen, when these countries actually harm their own citizens, and secondly, when these countries don't harm their citizens, and secondly, when they don't actually pose a threat on development in themselves. And once we see conflict in these countries, we already see a harm, ladies and gentlemen, which they don't actually address. And secondly, let's get to a bit of reconstruction. Now, they said we don't actually better the Islamic states, and we actually harm these Islamic states, ladies and gentlemen. And there isn't any long-term benefit. We say that firstly, because the Islamic State is one group, specifically in Iraq and all these other countries, it's easier to target and easier to deal with the problem directly because they're in one specific state. But besides that, ladies and gentlemen, even if that is not the point, because they are one state and because they're in a specific area, it simply means they're easier to directly deal with, and which then means that this brings long-term benefits. But other than that, let's get to a bit of my positive matter. And under my positive matter, I had a thesis, which is how we actually ensure significant progress and development in states affected by the conflict. For example, states like Iraq and Syria. So how exactly is military intervention beneficial for future claims of these other countries? Firstly, we prevent conflict, and why is that good? This means that we are for protecting the citizens of these countries, which is actually the main reason why the United Nations is there, to actually ensure peace, ladies and gentlemen. And once we actually use military intervention and means of military interventions it becomes the most legitimate and most effective way to actually ensure long-term peace, ladies and gentlemen. That is what we want. Not actually discussing the matters of conflict. Yes, sir.
Sir, but what you're doing with your entire case is assuming that the military intervention is going to work, which it will not. So there we go.
Besides that, even if it wasn't gonna work in the short term, we say that long-term benefits, ladies and gentlemen, are actually beneficial to the society themselves. Now, what do I mean by this? This means that society will actually be protected by the very same government, ladies and gentlemen. Besides the government, by the United Nations, who these other countries stand for. Now, we tell you why then is it fair to do so, ladies and gentlemen. Like I've shown you, we protect the society. Secondly, we besides harming these countries' sovereignty, we stand for these countries and help them in future development and progress, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the nature of countries like Iraq and Syria these countries don't actually hesitate to start a war within their own countries. Secondly, there are already terrorists in those countries and killings, ladies and gentlemen. So how do we actually ensure benefits? We actually protect these people. Secondly, we ensure buy-in of these other countries like the United States and Russia, specifically because they invest in these countries for example, oil, with oil and all these other resources being tested. Now, why is it important for countries like the United States and Russia to intervene? Because firstly, they have the necessary means of enforcing peace, ladies and gentlemen, specifically for the United Nations, and secondly, because these countries are actually capable of doing so. Now, this then brings me to the responsibility to protect of these countries in themselves. Now, we say that firstly, these countries, for example, Iraq and Syria, we understand that they have their own sovereignty, but in my rebuttal, I also told you that we actually can, but in this case, we can limit sovereignty when it then harms society. Now, why is this then important, ladies and gentlemen? It means that the United Nations simply lives up to its aims, and secondly, it actually lives up to its it actually functions better internally. Now, this directly clashes with the whole point of capability of these countries, where I told you that countries like the United States and Russia are actually capable of intervening, ladies and gentlemen. Now, why is it then bad to actually? Now, we understand that there are harms to actually intervening in countries like Iraq and Syria. For example, like more death. But we tell you that once we intervene, we actually reduce these deaths in terms of long-term benefits, ladies and gentlemen. What do I mean by this? I mean that once we intervene, people will die. Yes, we concede to that. But once we directly deal with the problem now and finish with the problem, we actually make sure that the problem doesn't actually expand and doesn't get exaggerated and maximized. Now, why is this then important? This means that all these countries who do actually create these wars, ladies and gentlemen, who have conflict, it simply means that they don't live up to the United Nations aims and the United Nations aims, which is actually to enforce peace, ladies and gentlemen. Now, what am I showing you in today's debate? I'll firstly show you two things: how we ensure long-term benefits, and how even if intervention does cause death, it actually limits the death in terms of long-term development and progress. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, I've then showed you how military intervention becomes a necessity, and secondly, how military intervention is justified in this case. Thank you.
Let's now welcome Eva Deck, position.
Thank you for the floor. If what today's government is telling us were true, then we wouldn't have the problem with ISIS. Because if what they're telling you was true, then the first intervention of the Western forces into the Iraq would have been successful, would have established long-term stability, would have created a functional state that was able to protect its citizens, and wouldn't have radicalized the Iraqi people. But what we see is that exactly the opposite happened. And by intervening again, we will just prolong the anti-Western sentiment, we will just prolong the incentive of radicalized movements to go and create a conflict. And because of that, we fiercely oppose the intervention in the Iraq and Syria territories. Now what I will do in my speech is I will clarify a couple of points of contention, and then with the rest of the material from the side of the opposition, I will intertwine with my own argument, which talks about how this is going to create even less stability directly in the Western countries. But firstly, let's talk about what we've heard from the side of the government. Firstly, they come up and they said that the military intervention is justified when we have tried all the alternatives and none of them work, or none of them are applicable in the first place. But what we see here is that there's a lot of alternatives, and I'm just going to throw out a couple of them that the Western countries haven't tried yet in order to resolve the conflict. We've seen very little diplomatic efforts into the conflict, especially considering the fact, no thank you, that since the intervention, since ISIS has taken over actually the territories, it's been 3 or 4 weeks, okay, so in these 3 or 4 weeks, there were literally no diplomatic efforts, even in trying to solve the conflict diplomatically, no thank you. Second of all, we saw that there is a lot of possibilities that also other countries in the region are considering, okay? For example, there is the possibility of lifting some of the economic sanctions on Iran in order for Iran to cooperate positively with Bashar al-Assad regime in order to resolve the conflict inside of the region instead of with outside intervention, okay? So we haven't tried that. We also haven't tried lifting some of the restrictions and penalties on Syria that we have given onto them because of their chemical weapons attack. And we see that this is also a possibility, and I think with which we can bring Bashar al-Assad to our side instead of intervening in the region. So we said there's a lot of possibilities diplomatic that haven't been exhausted yet, and because of that, they're claiming that this is the last possibility. I think that doesn't hold true. Second of all, they talk about how this is a moral imperative because we have to fight against violent regimes, and we oppose this in principle because we see that the United Nations have not upheld this principle in the past. Okay, there is no precedent that every time that there is a genocide going on, the United Nations are there. No, thank you. Are there to intervene. Okay, we've seen Rwanda. We've seen a lot of examples where the United Nations forces have intervened, even though there was a genocide taking place. And the reason why they intervened is because they calculated what will the risk and the consequences be. Okay, so if there is no, even if the genocide is going on, if there's no possibility to resolve it from inside of the country, there's no reason to go in because you're just going to make a bigger mess. And we also see that when they ask for another examples of oppressive regimes, or for example, Islamist jihadist military groups, we have, for example, Boko Haram that is happening currently in Nigeria. And we see that this is a very oppressive and a very jihadist group, a very Islamic and opposition, but we don't see the United Nations intervening anywhere there. So we see that this falls on principle. Now they talk about they talk about how Islamic states on principle need Western help to develop. And we see that this is simply not true because we've seen the example of Arab Spring where there was a spontaneous development inside of the Islamic countries. So we don't see that in order for democracy to be established, there necessarily has to be Western intervention. But second of all, we see that there is also a lot of different possibilities that we can stimulate development there, without this being a military intervention. And then they come up in their second argument in their second speech is apparently how this is going to disincentivize future claims for this Islamist oppression in those states. And we see that this, first of all, this is asserting that we would actually solve the conflict and we would be the victorious ones in there, which we don't believe it's true. We think that this is more likely to be next to Vietnam than anything else. But second of all, and more importantly, we see that the reason why those extremist military groups appear in those countries is because of their anti-Western sentiment. And we see that by sending Western military intervention in those regions, we're actually reinforcing this radicalized movement. And because of that, we're creating the even more incentive for them to appear than before. Now let's move to my constructive material. Before that,
if you live in Baghdad and you have the ISIS outside of your door, do you really think your anti-Western sentiment is really going to be that strong that you won't let other people help you?
Yeah, I think that it will. I think that anti-Western sentiment is the main reason that there is a big conflict between the Islamic countries in the Middle East and the United States. We've seen that Iran, for example, is strictly anti-Western, and because of that, we see that we've had very little progress with Iran in the past couple of decades. We also see that the basis for the philosophy of ISIS and for the philosophy of Al-Qaeda and things like this is the anti-Western sentiment sprang from the school of Qutb, one of the Muslims-made philosophers. And because of that, we believe that anti-Western sentiment is exactly the reason that drives those groups. Moving back to my constructive material. What we've seen is that the United States and Western military strategies are not particularly effective in the Middle East. Now the fact is that first of all, the Middle East is very diverse in terms of different opposition groups, but what those opposition groups have in common is mostly this anti-Western radicalist sentiment. What we see that every time when we come here into this region, and we've seen this in the example of Iraq, we've seen this in the example of Libya, we've seen this in the example of Afghanistan, what happens is here, no thank you, that even if we manage to gain control over a small portion of rebels there is a huge opposition movement to the United States or to the Western engagement into the conflict. We see that because of that, we're radicalizing even the people that have not been radicalized before. And we're actually making an enemy, no thank you, of the people that could have been our diplomatic allies. We see that what also we risk here in this particular example is that we will even more radicalize Bashar al-Assad, because now we are now ISIS is the enemy of the state of Syria. But if we intervene, we will be the more likely enemy to the state of Syria, and we will push Bashar al-Assad towards the allyship with ISIS, which we see that is also dangerous. Because those military interventions have been so unsuccessful before, and because of all those reasons that it's so hard to maintain control over the territory, we believe that this would only not resolve conflict, but prolong it. We've seen that the situation in Iraq, and we believe that the situation in Iraq would have resolved much more quickly and much more spontaneously, as we have seen the resolution of, for example, the situation in Egypt, if we hadn't intervened 10 or 12 years ago. We see that because of that, we believe that there will be much more civilian casualties under their scenario than under just leaving the ISIS to resolve under diplomatic pressures. There will be more refugees that will again cause the diplomatic strains with other regions, other countries in the Middle Eastern region. We see that there will be again a crisis infrastructure in Iraq and in Syria that will enable future militarist groups to take over much more easily. And because of that, we see that we will just prolong the situation as it is, and we will cause much more harm than if we just resolve the situation diplomatically. And because of those reasons, because we do not want another Iraq, let's not again invade. Thank you.
Member of Government.
Opening opposition seems to agree with us and say that there is a necessity to stop ISIS. So on outside of the House today, what we need to prove is just two things. First of all, we need to prove the problem needs to be stopped now, not later. And secondly, we need to prove how military intervention is an effective means of doing this, which is what I will be covering in my extension today. But before I get into that, I have 3 points of contention. First of all, on how previous intervention and how this is different. Second of all, on the anti-Western sentiments. And thirdly, on the effectivity. So on the first one, on the previous intervention, now this is different. What we see now is that what we see now and how it's different from the past is that right now these countries are asking for people to come in. We see that the people are asking for military intervention from the West to come in and stop ISIS because they're extremely scared of what's going on. Secondly, we see that this is very different from the past because this is an actual organization going and taking over several countries. It's not just a government within one country that's suppressing its people. This is spreading very fast, and that's why it needs to stop. So as we said, in other interventions, we also see that there were sometimes other reasons for them actually having these interventions. For example, the US wanting oils and things like this. So this is extremely different from previous interventions. So on the second point of contention, on the anti-Western sentiments, they talked about how it's going to radicalize everyone else. Well, first of all, we believe that ISIS cannot be any more radical than it already is. Furthermore, then they talked about how the current people that are living there will also start becoming radicalized if the West go in because, they have these anti-Western sentiments. But as I stated already, what we see is that these people are asking for intervention. These people want the West because they're more scared of ISIS than they are of the Western population. As I said, they're mostly scared of ISIS because what does ISIS do? They go into these cities, they take over the cities, and they kill a lot of people. They drag them through the street, they hang them in the streets, things like this. It's a lot worse than what the West do. They go in, they check the passports of random people passing in the street, and you have the wrong religion, they'll shoot you right in the head. That's what ISIS does, and that is worse than the West. That's why people, they would rather have the West come in than having ISIS take over the cities and kill them. Yes?
No, what actually happens is that they shoot you in the head if you're somehow connected with the West. So what we're seeing here is absolutely no
because we also see, for example, in Islam, we have 2 different factions. We have the Sunnis and the Shia. They see that if you're of the other faction, they will also shoot you in the head. They will kill anyone that doesn't agree with their very extreme beliefs. So you don't see that just because now you're a Sunni living in Syria or Iraq, and now ISIS is coming, you're suddenly going to switch to Shia and become radicalized in that way. No, you would rather have the West actually come in and protect you and protect your right to religion. This is what the people want. So we see that ISIS is much more extreme than the West, and that's why people will actually rather have the West come in. So on the third point of attention on the effectivity, I'm going to have integrated rebuttal on this in my extensions, which I'll be going to now. And again, as I said, why it's necessary to have it now and not why it's necessary to have intervention now and not later, why it's not enough for these regimes to stop themselves, and secondly, why military intervention is effective specifically against ISIS. So on the first one, I have 4 points. First of all, we see, people are already dying right now. We see a loss of sovereignty. We see ISIS, as I said, they go in and they kill everyone of the wrong religion, even other factions of Islam. They go in and they kill these people without any, anything else. We see people being dragged in the street. We see people being hung in the street. This was already developed brilliantly by opening government, how there is a clear need and people are dying and losing their rights in these countries. But secondly, we see that ISIS, if we don't stop them, they're only going to be getting stronger. And there's several reasons for this. Firstly, as we already stated, they're very quickly moving through these citizen territories. That's why it sprang up, just within a few weeks, suddenly, they were a self-proclaimed state and they had a lot of territory, several different states. So they were moving extremely fast through this. We see that this success is going to encourage even more new followers. They're going to find more radical people and see, okay, ISIS is actually doing something. They're actually going through this. I have the same beliefs as them. So we see that they will be able to recruit more people. Furthermore, we see that it's going to encourage the current donors that they have to spend even more money on ISIS. They're going to be donating even more money. Because what people do we see investing in ISIS right now? We see very religious fundamentalists, and they're seeing success right now, so they're going to be investing even more into them. So they will only be getting stronger. Furthermore, we see that the success that they have had so far will make ISIS bold. They're going to want to be risking even more, pushing even further, so they will only be getting stronger and doing more if we don't stop them right now. Yes?
Go ahead.
Okay, but if the if the Western intervention comes in and is defeated, this will only prop up and amplify the effects that you've just listed. So
okay, I'll respond to that later in my second argument on how intervention is effective. But on the third point now, on this why it's necessary now and not later, also, we see that we still have ties in the region right now. We're still able to do something against ISIS. For example, we see Israel is still in the region. The US have very strong ties with Israel. This is only going to help if you actually want to stop a conflict. Furthermore, we see that as they already mentioned on opening opposition, Iraq has already asked for intervention. We see that Syria is also looking for this. So we see that with time, we're actually going to be losing these ties. We're going to have actually the whole of Iraq is going to be taken over. We have less of an entry point to actually be able to come in and stop it. On the fourth point, we see that they have already captured a lot of US equipment, a lot of Western equipment, very advanced equipment, that right now they don't really know how to use. But we see that if we give them time enough, ISIS will be able, they will start using this equipment, they will learn how to use this equipment, and they'll be using that against people and moving even quicker through the countries. So again, with time they will be doing this. So we see it quite clear that there's a need to intervene now and not later, not wait around.
Sure.
No, thank you. So now I'm moving on to my my second point on why military intervention is effective, specifically against ISIS. So first of all, let's look at the nature of ISIS and the success that they have. Firstly, we see that it's an Islamic state, and that's why they have a very strong religious. It's easy for them to recruit religious people. Second, we see that they've already found aggression to be effective. And thirdly, they have money backing them. So let's look at why military intervention is effective against these three things. First of all, on the first one, on the Islamic State, we see that Western countries. We see that they follow very much religious leaders in this. It's very much based on religious ideals. So we see that Western countries and Western factions, they will be able to recognize this and they'll be more specialized in their warfare. We see factions such as, if the US goes in, we see the factions such as CIA will focus on specific targets. They'll focus on the religious leaders. They can also do this through the use of drone strikes against the ISIS, which we've already found very effective under the Obama administration. So they will be able to take them down on their religious belief and people will stop falling. So on the second point on how they've already found aggression effective, we see that if we do have military intervention, we're going to stop their approach at least quite significantly. Maybe we're not going to stop completely their approach to take over, but we'll definitely limit it. Now why is this good? We see that when they're limited, they're going to be more interested in actually coming to the table and having negotiations. So they talk on their side of the house about peace talks. We see that if we don't stop their aggression, they're just going to continue doing this. They have no interest in having peace talks right now. So we see if we stop them, if we limit their approach, they'll be much more likely to come to the table and have peace talks. That's what we stand for on our side of the house. Thirdly, we see, on the point of money, as I already said, who is actually backing off right now? We see that it's rich religious fundamentalists in other Arab countries. Why? Because first of all, they want to spread Islam like these. They want to spread their own ideals. So if they see, first of all, that I already had my first point, if the religious leaders are being killed in their country, and secondly, if we see that the approach is no longer that effective, if their approach is being limited, they will be less inclined to actually fund ISIS and help them, and the donations will increase. So those are the three reasons why ISIS will be less effective on the military intervention. So because we've proven that it's very clear that there's a need to do this now, not later, because people are dying and ISIS is just going through these countries and spreading very rapidly, and because we've proven that it's effective, specifically against ISIS, we take this debate today.
that opposition thus far has shown you that support on the ground when dealing with religious groups and radicalist groups that have an inherent belief within religions, that support from the very society is actually quite important when dealing with radicalist groups. Simply because within the future themselves, they could actually develop and further create more radical groups, which you've seen happen throughout history. But what we as side closing opposition, what we're going to show you is that even if their intervention was going to be successful in dealing with that one radicalist group, that it does not actually help the country within the long run, taking into aspects such as your social issues, economic issues, as well as political stability. But now, with that dealt with, I'd like to get into some few issues of refutation. But first, I'd like to deal with the opening side before I actually move on to the closing side. So now let's look at what the opening side is actually said within a nutshell. So you see that from the opening side, they just generically said that intervention is actually quite successful. And secondly, that they're not supposed to, that other methods of actually dealing with a situation that exists within countries like Iraq and Syria have not been successful. We see that closing opposition has a problem with the fact that they have not given us analysis as to showing us how those other mechanisms have failed within status quo. But moreover, let's play ball with the given solution that they've actually tried to propose to the House thus far. So you see that they said that, okay, fine, these interventions are actually quite successful because countries will be willing to go in. We said this is wrong for two reasons. We have two responses to this. We tell you that firstly, intervention in and of itself is likely to be unsuccessful because of the nature of countries that they wanted them to action this very intervention to begin with. So they say that they want the United Nations Security Council to assure that this intervention actually goes through and works properly. What we see is that the United Nations Security Council themselves already have involvements within Iraq and Syria. How so? And let's look at how those involvements actually further harm the situation. So that firstly, military advice, like they wanted, is actually given to these two countries. Secondly, supplies in terms of arms, which is something that they want, is already given to these countries. So that the only difference here is the fact that their own troops and military intervention is not given to this country. Why so? We see that because of those very two reasons I've given you earlier. We see that countries like the US have actually tried to have some sort of military intervention going in the first place. But we see that that was actually vetoed against Russia. How so? Because like they said, these two countries actually have some sort of investment within these nations. And they say that the best way to protect these investments within these nations is to somewhat arm the people on the ground, to somewhat support them, to somewhat deal with the issue at hand. They feel as though that this is a proper mechanism. And because of the veto, that action will not happen. So I don't think intervention is actually like to happen on that ground. But we see that on the second reason. The reason why we wouldn't have this intervention from an open perspective is simply because, it's simply because of the future prospects of that very country in and of itself. We don't think they've taken that into account. What we show you as closing opposition is the fact that these countries don't want any Western involvement, whether it be these radicalist groups or whether it be the citizens on the ground. The sort of history that these countries had with Western influence has never been actually a good one. We take into account the war in Afghanistan, where Russia and the US actually used it as a battleground to actually have some proxy war to see whether or not capitalism or socialism is actually good enough for the country. We see that the sort of perception that goes around Middle Eastern countries is that once the West gets involved, they have some sort of large amount of dominance and they don't leave. And we think that that perspective actually harms future social prospects for Middle Eastern countries within themselves. So now, let's look at the closing perspective and what we've received thus far. So we see that on the ground, they said that, okay, groups of ISIS, they do exist, they're terrible, it's all terrible, game over. But what they say further than that is that it's as worse as it's ever going to get. Meaning that even if the analysis that was brought this far by closing opposition was inherently true, what they say is that you don't get worse than ISIS. We don't think we actually take such things into account. Simply because even if you do have a radicalist group that wasn't as bad as ISIS to actually begin with, we think that that actually becomes a problem. But now let's say that doesn't take into perspective. So they say that Western rebellion is likely to stop simply because the West is in there, they have some sort of intervention in there, and they're actually better situations on the ground. We think that that's the very reason why these radicalist groups actually formed in the first place, because there is some sort of Western involvement within these nations. The inherent perception that these West is actually there to exploit, the freedoms that they have in such nations. Because of that very perception, we say that Western rebellions will always exist and they will always continue to grow. And we feel that they did not take that into account. So then, moreover, they tell us about ties and the fact that these nations, that countries like the US, actually have ties with Middle Eastern countries, and they should actually take that into account before they actually have some sort of military intervention. We have two responses under this. Tell that firstly, because they really have some sort of ties, we think that they could actually try and have some sort of, negotiations, which is what the closing opposition speaker said that they would consider even after the military intervention has actually been taken into account. But secondly, we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that intervention actually further harms those ties, because it seems like as though they override the sovereignty of the countries on the ground, because they see that with that very intervention, ladies and gentlemen, they will have some sort of they will have some sort of influence over the decisions they take as a country, because they're going to have to repair themselves. But I'll flag that within my speech and further show that within my analysis. So now let me give you a case split of how I'll be dealing with this case. I'll be showing you I'll be answering the question of, does the nature of intervention actually produce significant results in liberating Middle Eastern countries like Syria as well as Iraq? So now I'm going to be answering a couple of questions. I'll take you within a minute, Peter. So we asked ourselves the first question: does the nature of radicalism actually allow Western input, even after it had been deemed successful? But before I answer that question, yes, we can.
Tell us what happens when negotiations don't work and answer an alternative.
Well, what happens here, we don't think that that's our mandate. We should actually show that intervention themselves isn't as successful, and it actually proves far more harms than what other methods. That's what you set yourselves out to do, and you did not prove that. So now let me get to my issue here. So what happens here is that, does the nature of radicalism actually allow Western input? We tell you no, simply because of the inherent principles and the beliefs that they have. We see that amongst analysis that we receive from government in its entirety, it's fact that it's easier to target this war simply because radicalist groups are simple to find because they believe in inherent religion. We don't think that that is true. We think that it's actually harder to locate them because they're far more spread out within the nation themselves. We think that they all believe within a similar principle. We believe that they actually have some sort of Islam. So we see that they would actually believe them to a different degree, but at the end of the day, they actually have the same basis in and of itself. So now let's look in terms of on the social level, how this would actually form a rise for rebellion. We said even after the intervention was actually supposed to happen, we said that such nations are going to have some sort of influence and input in the mechanisms and the decisions that these countries take to better themselves after the situation they've been in with these radicalist groups. What does this mean? We get citizens in the ground inherently believe that their sovereignty is actually being hampered upon. How so? Because they're being told on how they should actually regulate themselves, how they should better themselves to actually deal with the problem that they've been given ever since they've actually been the radicalist groups. So what have I shown you this far? I've actually shown you that citizens on the ground, even after the intervention that they say that they're begging for, actually would go against this, but moreover, would actually spark some sort of opening for more radicalist groups to actually appear. But we see that this will be further analyzed within my second speaker, and with that said, we still don't accept this motion.
Speaker of Site-Governmental Processes.
Okay. Okay, I will first put this debate into perspective, and it's quite simple, really. We see that there is a necessity. Team proposition has beautifully lined this out. We can see that, yes, people are dying at the moment, people are being executed in the streets, people are getting killed for absolutely no reason, and this has to be stopped. The answer from team opposition was mainly, yeah, we kind of agree with that, we're not going to really deal with it. However, yeah, but there is a necessity. However, it is not effective if we have military intervention. So that's where the key is. If we are effective in actually military intervening and stopping ISIS, we have fulfilled this necessity of stopping what they are doing. So this is why it's very easy to outline why my extension speaker has made this case for us today. So I will be doing that in 3 clashes, and we'll all fit into why this will be effective. Why can we actually do this? Because there is legitimacy. We've outlined why the UN has any footing in this. We have outlined why people are killing. These 2 things are basically covered on time proposition. We just have to effectively show you why it's effective, and I'll do that right now. I'll be talking about IR and how this can be very well be done in the Middle East at the moment. I'll be talking about how we can stop them, how we have to do that right now if we want to have a good effect, and who will actually do this better later, and what development will be in the country later. But first of all, I would like to point out one thing, and that's why is ISIS different? Why do we have to do this now? And we very easily spread out, I told you, because it's expansionism. It is expanding faster than any other group we see in the world today, faster than any other group. Go ahead.
Okay, first of all, the expansion of ISIS has been temporarily halted already. But second of all, the same holds true for Al-Qaeda. And we saw that we weren't able to stop Al-Qaeda or deal with the situation in Iraq 12 years ago.
Al-Qaeda is far less enthusiastic about taking over the entirety of the Middle East than ISIS. Its plans are extremely clear. Al-Qaeda doesn't have close to the amount of money, it doesn't have close to the amount of people, and it doesn't have close to the amount of extremism to actually accomplish this. Well, ISIS does have all of these things, and Al-Qaeda even shows its disapproval of ISIS methods, because they are so effective, and because, yes, it might be a temporary halt, but their groups and their plans are still there, they still have the people, they still have the money, and they still have the weapons. So, I'll go into that into my second class, though. First, I'll go into IR, and why we can do this. Because Team Opposition seems to believe that there's so much Western anti-sentiment in the region that somehow they do not want us to be there. Well, this is simply not true. We can see there's a very much anti-ISIS sentiment in the region. We see that Syria, we see that Iran, we see that Israel, we see that Al-Qaeda, and we see that Iraq all want to go against ISIS. Iraq has already asked Westerns to come in and actually stop what's going on. No, thank you, man. So, we see that in IR, this is the perfect moment to strike, because now we actually have the sentiment of the region. We actually have the other players around us agreeing with us. In Iraq, why Bush failed is because no one else agreed with him. It was just America versus Iraq, and there was very little. No, thank you, sir. What we see now, however, is that the other players in the region actually want to stop ISIS.
Sir.
This is go ahead.
The Prime Minister asking, being a representative of the Shia group there, does not actually mean that all the civilians on the ground in Iraq and Syria support this intervention. So please, show us how this happens.
Okay, so basically by asking that question, you have already agreed to me that the countries actually will work together. So Iran will work. And Syria will, because you target the people, you don't target the government, which is what I was talking about. We do, however, see that Syria and Iran both want to go in. But why isn't it happening right now? Why aren't these cities being taken back? And why are they just remaining there, taken by ISIS? It's because they're scared. It's because they are afraid people are going to die if they go in. They're afraid Iran and Syrian people are going to die. Bashar al-Assad is not in any way going to do this because it has to fight also rebels on its other side. So it doesn't, they're scared. However, what will actually help them? What Team Opposition suggests is that we'll give them less sanctions and we'll actually help them go in there. However, this course is not going to take away the fear they have. However, what will actually get rid of the fear is if we bring in other military groups that will actually give them a chance to win. No, thank you. Because you are not going in a war that you know you're not going to win. That's why they're not going in at the moment. However, we as the West and as the UN have a chance to turn these tables and actually show we can win. And that's why I'll line up with my second argument, which is that we can stop them and we can do it now. Well, thank you, man. We can do it now. We can see that there is great advanced military in the West. This is not ISIS. This is not the Middle East. This is the West with the largest military budget in the world that can actually accomplish something. It is insane to believe, no thank you sir, that America with all its military power and the other countries also agreeing with cannot stop ISIS. It is not, no thank you sir, it's not as that big yet to actually stop these great military powers. It's not Iraq, it's not an entire country yet. However, they are expanding, and if we wait longer, they will become a country with a lot more supporters, and then we actually have a force to fight. But right now, no thank you ma'am, the West and its partners in the Middle East, such as Syria, such as Iran, such as Israel, can actually accomplish something together. And isn't that the best way to solve this entire anti-Western sentiment? Because if we actually succeed, which we can do, due to our advanced military, we can actually make a difference there, and no thank you ma'am, in this anti-Western sentiment. They are just suggesting we leave it this way. However, we suggest a way we can actually solve this anti-Western sentiment by stopping ISIS, the common enemy at the moment. But then they come up and say, well, the people don't support us. The people on the ground don't support us. Well, to this we say, this is simply not true. In Baghdad, people are scared to death of ISIS at the moment. They're not joining them at masses. No, this is not happening. We say that they bring up Twitter and how they're helping Twitter. Twitter is somehow the key to their great power. This is not the case. We still see that half of the religious people will be prosecuted if ISIS takes over. That's half the country that will be killed. So of course there's going to be supporters on the ground for Western intervention because their lives are on the line. We still see other people that don't want to be in this complete control of Islam. And of course these people will also support it. It's not like everyone is a religious fundamentalist there at the moment. This is simply not the case. So yes, we have people on the ground that actually support military intervention and want ISIS to be stopped. So now, what actually works out best later? Well, firstly on side proposition, we want to see ISIS stop. This is what we want to have. Because what we have already outlined is that they are killing people. Their law, the Sharia law that they will put in place will greatly harm the development of the country due to no education for women, due to no laws protecting women, and just the overall human rights violations that will happen at that moment. Well then, the opposition came up and said, well, in the end it will be worse because the anti-Western sentiment will grow. I've already outlined why this will not happen, because at the moment we have a common enemy, which is ISIS, and people are asking the West to help. Iraq is asking the West to actually intervene. So no, why it would be very strange how now we're actually doing what they want, and then the anti-Western movement will go. Then they suggest that other extremist groups will take over. Well, nothing is as strong as ISIS at the moment as an extremist group that actually takes over. So if you actually take down a lot of these people, their money flow will be gone, their military will be gone, and of course there will not be enough of this to actually group up and make another extremist movement if they have already been taken down. Their entire cause is not there at the moment. So because we've shown you how it is effective, we have won this case.
Okay, and now for the last speech, speaker of opposition, and to close the debate as a whole.
This debate is boiled down to two simple questions. That's why we're analyzing this debate using two simple questions. Firstly, which side best benefits Syria? And secondly, is military intervention workable? And are there any other workable mechanisms, ladies and gentlemen? So without going any further, I'd like to go to my issues of refutation. So under my first question, firstly, we tell you that proposition, or rather government, that had to show us that there are no other workable mechanisms or other workable alternatives, ladies and gentlemen. Of which we showed you that there are other workable mechanisms, ladies and gentlemen. Of which they could actually consider to the fact that negotiations are workable, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll deal with that under my second question, ladies and gentlemen. So under this, they tell us that there is no other alternative. We show you that there are other workable alternatives, ladies and gentlemen. Other than that, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that there is no incentive for military intervention. We tell you that military intervention will actually will only exacerbate the harm. Also, we tell you that there will be more killings within these countries, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover, damages of infrastructure. They stand for development. They stand for peace. And we tell you that this will actually limit the development of these countries. I'll take you in a moment. We tell you that, secondly, they tell us that the UN is to ensure peace and development. Firstly, we tell you that first response to this is that we tell you that this will actually infuriate these terrorists, because firstly these terrorists will be angry, and therefore these terrorists will actually go back and fight back strongly, ladies and gentlemen. And it shows that the killings will actually be more, ladies and gentlemen. It shows that it actually exacerbates the harm. And secondly, we tell you that there won't be any development in Syria, ladies and gentlemen, because we've shown you the second response to this is that if there will be any development in Syria, of which we've shown you that there won't be, we tell you that other countries will be actually harmed, ladies and gentlemen. For example, countries like South Africa are overly populated by people from Congo, ladies and gentlemen, by people from Somalia, because people from Somalia are the people that actually went out of Somalia because of the wars within those countries. We tell you that South Africa's development is actually limited, limited, ladies and gentlemen. We tell you that there's no development within their policy and there's no peace
Sir.
within their policy. I'll take you, sir.
So you're saying that these people that are going to move out of the country, those will be the people prosecuted by ISIS. So would you rather suggest they are killed than are immigrating to another country?
First, we tell you that within status quo, we still have people that go to other countries and actually overpopulate those other countries and actually increase the unemployed rate, ladies and gentlemen. It harms the other countries' development. They have to show us why it will actually be beneficial to other countries too, ladies and gentlemen. Other countries are countries within Syria's continent are the forgotten actors, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover, we tell you that under this, Syria, ladies and gentlemen, so countries like Syria, ladies and gentlemen, don't actually allow for any Western influence, ladies and gentlemen. We tell you that firstly, Syria won't actually end up, Syrian citizens or the Syrian government won't actually allow for any intervention or any help from the Western countries, ladies and gentlemen, because they stand for this whole idea that they don't want any Western influence, ladies and gentlemen. But over that, they tell you that this brings about long-term benefits. We tell you that we didn't actually receive any benefit. We tell you that we didn't actually receive any benefits from this side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover, we tell you that there are more harms under this policy. And I've shown you at the beginning of my point of my speech that there will be more harms within the entire policy. Lastly, they tell us that this will actually allow for allies to bring about more militants. And under that, they tell us that the nature of these states is actually not to allow any use of other methods, ladies and gentlemen. So even if that's the case, we tell you that we'd rather limit Syria's sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen, because within the UN's aims is to actually ensure peace and development. They conceded to that, ladies and gentlemen. And we tell you that to ensure peace and development within the UN, they'd rather do that in any way. They'd rather actually benefit the people in any way, even if it means limiting this, the state's sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, we tell you, but lastly, we tell you that we would rather use other workable mechanisms, ladies and gentlemen. And secondly, the other responses under this is that they tell us that firstly they protect the citizens within their state, ladies and gentlemen. We tell you that there's no protection to these to the citizens within their state, ladies and gentlemen, because firstly there will be more killings, ladies and gentlemen. What they didn't take into account is the countries like the US, countries like Russia that actually use drones for military interventions, ladies and gentlemen. We tell you that those drones actually drop bombs that actually kill the people, that actually damage infrastructure, ladies and gentlemen. We tell you that that Syria will be harmed in the long run, ladies and gentlemen. They have to show us why countries like the US and countries like Russia will actually benefit from help Syria benefit from this, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover, we tell you that secondly, under this they tell us that they benefit society. We tell you that no, as I told you before, that there won't be any benefits to society. But before I go any further, defend yourself.
Tell us any other workable mechanisms and tell us how they will benefit.
Firstly, I don't actually need to give you any workable mechanism. That's not within our mandate. But even if that's the case, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that the Prime Minister of closing government actually conceded to the fact that negotiations are workable. That's why they actually gave us a contradiction under this. They tell us that this military intervention will actually lead to negotiations, ladies and gentlemen. Ironically, from the first speech, they told us that there are no other workable mechanisms. But moreover, we tell you that we don't actually understand why there should be any military intervention and more killings before actually having negotiations and using our workable mechanisms, ladies and gentlemen. Because they consider to the fact that negotiations are workable. Therefore, we need to take negotiations firstly, ladies and gentlemen. And actually, we actually need to take our negotiations firstly. Therefore, it will be beneficial to these people. Because they consider to the fact that negotiations are workable and there are other workable mechanisms. We've shown you that there's no necessity for this problem, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover, we ask one simple question under this. Why didn't they actually consider a military intervention in the first place? We tell you that firstly, they saw that military intervention is harmful to them, and there's no benefits to Syria in the first place, ladies and gentlemen, or rather in the long run, ladies and gentlemen. We tell you that this problem in Syria has been happening for the long for a long time right now, ladies and gentlemen, and therefore there have to be any some sort of negotiations, ladies and gentlemen, and therefore the military intervention will actually harm these people, ladies and gentlemen. So what have we shown you within this debate, ladies and gentlemen? Firstly, we've shown you that there's no necessity for military intervention. Secondly, we've shown you that military intervention is not workable. Thirdly, we've shown you that it doesn't actually bring about any significant benefits. And lastly, we've shown you that military intervention actually exacerbates the harm. That's why I actually proudly oppose this motion. Thank you.